when you get started. Coming back. Yeah, staying here for a while somehow.
السلام عليكم. الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله. أشهد أن محمدًا رسول الله. أشهد أن محمدًا رسول الله. حي على الصلاة. حي على الصلاة. حي على الفلاح. حي على الفلاح. الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله.
إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونتوب إليه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا. من يهدي الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له، وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له، وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله صلى الله عليه وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما كثيرا. أما بعد. Respected elders, dear sisters, dear brothers, the theme of our khutbah today, inshallah, is to talk about something that seems to be cyclical and comes back every time we come to some sort of year end and the start of a new year. And although this particular topic is getting a little tired, given that two people cover it from a number of perspectives, I took the liberty today to choose a perspective that, inshallah, if Allah guides me, it'll be of some use and some value to you. I'm going to call this a little work to cultivate introspection and retrospection for making ourselves better human beings. So it's a little bit of a long title, but it's not overwhelming. These two skills of introspection and retrospection are vital, and they have existed since the dawn of time, that different people cultivate them in different ways. So before we get too much into the details of them, perhaps with your permission, if you allow me, I will define them in my own terms and see if we can agree on them as being the way we will understand them for the balance of the time and the remainder of the khutbah. Introspection is the means by which we look inside ourselves. We take an honest, objective, and reasonably unbiased way of looking at our own being and just making an assessment. That's what introspection is. Retrospection is time-stamped. We take a certain period of time of our life that has elapsed, we reflect on it, and we say, what do we think we have done well that I think we should double down on? And what do we think we have done that we could improve upon, so we can go and learn from those things? So life becomes an accumulated experience rather than a carnage of repeated mistakes. So these are the two skills that we will talk about today, inshallah. Obviously, my perspective always when I talk about these things is to give the voice to the Quran in order to be our guide, in order to teach us on how we put to use some of these elements, and inshallah ta'ala, God willing, if they are of some use to us, then we can see the benefits of them arrive. The scholars of Islam, since the beginning of working on this improvement of the self, this project of self-improvement in Islam has existed literally since the Prophet ﷺ showed up on the face of the planet and started to cultivate that understanding in people that followed him, and it remains to this very day. Except that the prophetic way of self-improvement differs from other ways by its very nature. It's prophetic. It has something rather unique to it, that obviously when we Muslims adhere to that particular model, this is always our reference. It's called our Qudwa, our Sunnah. That's the reference that we go by because of, quite frankly, very easy idea. One, the proven track record. It's amply evident that that system worked amazingly well. Two, the fact that it came from a role model that is deserving to be called a role model, and that's the Prophet ﷺ himself. And three is because it is systematized in a way where it is highly inclusive. It's not for the few that can afford it, or for some that can access it, and the rest that have to be thrown away from it. It is for all of us to be part of it. So the way that the scholars have always done this is to build this program on how we effectively engage introspection before retrospection, on working on the states of the self. They describe 3 states of the self. There is a very esoteric discussion that I will not get into now, and inshallah, if you want to go and search this by yourself and whatnot, what is a self? What do we mean by it? What is the difference between self and soul? What is the difference between being, self, and soul? These are very pedantic arguments that you can spend your lifetime working on them, and you might not end up with constructive conclusions. The purpose of a khutbah, the purpose of a Jumu'ah when we come together, is to provide the congregation with actionable things, not simply fluff that we talk about. So for the purposes of simplicity, self means simply our spiritual being, everything that is non-material. If it's not skin, if it's not hair, if it's not bone, it's other. We're talking about that one. And it's a very, very important component of our humanity. So they speak of the first entry level of that self and becoming conscious of it as being something called the nafs al-ammara, which is the commanding self. We all have this, we all share this, and here is an important statement. We all acquire this despite ourselves. You don't have to do any work for that one. It just comes with the territory. The moment you become a human being, and as soon as you learn that first word into your language, which has only 2 letters when you are this high as a baby, and they come out of your mouth and you say no to your parents, it started. That's it. You're into that world already. You have exercised that reality within you. The second one, and I'll unpack all of these through Quranic terms. The second one is what they refer to as a nafs al-lawwama. So this is a different type of self, or a refined type of self, which is called a conscious type of self. That's a modern term, and I purposefully chose it because I'll make the case that in fact that's what it means, and then we'll unpack that when we come to it as well. And the last one is a nafs al-mutma'inna, which is this tranquil, or this state of bliss in which the self gets, which you want to attain and retain. Attain and retain. And then we'll inshallah take these, and with your permission we can dive into it, and we take them one by one. Our hero and teacher for teaching us the first character of the first self, the commanding self in the Quran, is Yusuf alayhi salam. In fact, it is in his chapter, it's in chapter 12, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Holy Quran, "A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim," this is the voice of Yusuf speaking in the Quran. وَمَا أُبَرِّئُ نَفْسِي. I do not indulge or give passes to myself. إِنَّ النَّفْسَ لَأَمَّارَةٌ بِالسُّوءِ. Verily, this commanding self commands to that which is not good. I think this is like really an important point. It's really an important point. So we're talking about a prophetic voice. So the person who's speaking here is a prophetic voice that was sacralized through the Quran. It's coming to us in form of revelation as part of the Quran. And it has landed to us to show the human vulnerability, not showcased through some sort of superhero, but showcased through the life and experience of a prophet himself, who says, I'm human. I'm human, and tough stuff happens to all of us. But here is what's unique about Yusuf that the Quran is teaching us. Is the idea of finding this is when this sentiment gets awakened. لا أبرئ نفسي. I'm not going to make excuses for weird stuff. That's the important click into this teaching moment and the lessons of what Yusuf is doing. Then he does a piece of sheer genius. Okay, if you are wrestling a monster headache, you're gonna start popping pills. Maybe the box says no more than 2 every 4 hours, but it's a monster headache. You're gonna start taking 2 every 2 hours because you just wanna shake it off. It's debilitating, rightly so. Very unhealthy, but rightly so, it makes sense. What does Yusuf reach out for in order to bring this challenge of this nafs under his control? It's the next part of the verse that he describes. He says, "Illa ma rahima Rabbi," except that which God has mercy on. Which means that if you want to pop a bottle and go seek the best source that will help you bring your, if you want to call it basic instinct or animalistic instinct or whatever it is, with a successful strategy of containment, Allah has to be the source of your help. If not, it's not going to work. Does this make sense? So that's what this first advice is about. And then the verse concludes, Inna Rabbi Ghafurun Rahim. And I think that the big lesson from here is this idea that sometimes really the burden of guilt that we assign to ourselves is a little overbearing and a little too much. When the people of Sirah described the Prophet ﷺ, أنه كان كثير الاستغفار, he was constantly seeking repentance and atonement. It's not because the Prophet ﷺ had a guilt complex, a'udhu billah. The Prophet ﷺ never had a guilt complex. But it is the inoculation. It's the process by which he constantly replenished his energy in order for him to have the reserve of combating those things of the low life with successful strategies. So he drew his strength from istighfar. He was not escaping inside guilt. So that's the first big lesson of the first point. So now we come to the second one. This nafs lawama. This shows up in the Quran after 2 oaths that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala takes one after the other. He says, بعد أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم, لا أقسم بيوم القيامة, I swear by this day of reckoning and judgment, ولا أقسم بالنفس اللوامة, and I swear by this self that is called lawama, that is now conscious and has an orientation for the good. There's a general rule in the scholarship of the Quran. Verses that are neighboring to each other carry from one another because the assembly of the Quran is not accidental. So for example, if Allah took oath by saying, La uqsimu biyawm al-qiyamah, I take oath of this big day of reckoning that's coming, and he also said, I take oath of the glasses that are sitting on your kitchen counter, that would be a little absurd. You cannot compare the glasses on the kitchen counter with the day of judgment because they would be quite misaligned in terms of the logic of authorship. You have to bring, if you are going to put into the same run, the same idea, the elements that you are talking about are of the same importance. So stay with me on this one here. On this one, the Prophet Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in this ayah has elevated this description of this thing that is called a nafs al-lawama, by which he swore. He has elevated it to the awe and presence and importance of the day of judgment. That must be important, I think. That must be very important, otherwise it wouldn't be there. So what is this? So this is really a complex topic, this particular one of nafs al-lawama. I think the primary reason for which it's a complex topic is because when we are religious people, we are constantly swimming against the tide. The general culture that's around us is materialistic. In a materialistic culture, anything that is metaphysical is basically discarded or discounted as either being irrelevant or being some sort of imaginary friend that you have at your old age, or something that you really need to grow out of because it's not helping. So that's usually what materialistic cultures does to people who have an orientation for the metaphysical and the religious. Yet, this verse is teaching us that cultivating the understanding of a conscious self is as important as understanding the day of judgment. Are you with me? So that's the importance of what we are talking about in terms of what it is. You see, there are people, sometimes these materialistic cultures are very, 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 very tough to navigate. I'm a physicist by training, so my literature comes from there. Erwin Schrödinger, the guy who wrote the Schrödinger equations and who put the paradox together for the cat, the so-called Schrödinger's cat, wrote a book towards the end of his life after he got influenced by some Eastern writing that he read on his spare time, in which he postulates the following idea, in which he says that beyond this physicality of the physics that we are dealing with, there is something in this world that's called a common consciousness to which we all belong. We are all members of that common consciousness. Are you surprised as a Muslim? Absolutely not. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, I gathered you, I said to you, Alastu bi Rabbikum, and you said, yes, you are, and yes, we know we belong to a common consciousness. So that's why I'm not surprised. So I was blown away when this summer, the summer of this year, they actually had a symposium in London to revive this particular writing because they needed a voice to say that we are suffocating with alternatives that don't make sense. Can we at least have this? We can hear it? That's why this is important. So that's why this sort of stuff is helpful for our health and our future. Finally, we come to think about the two first ones, this starting self, this basic instinct, and this conscious self, which is the elevated state above the first one. Think of them as being stops, pit stops into the journey, but the destination is neither one nor the other. The destination is better than both. That is what is known as al-nafs al-mutma'inna. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran again uses his own voice to describe this. He says, Ya ayyatuha an-nafs al-mutma'inna. So he's describing this condition, this state. Irji'i ila rabbiki radiyatin mardiyah. So he's describing this. The word mutma'inna, impossible to translate. I'm just gonna try something. I'm not aiming for linguistic accuracy, I'm gonna try something. I'm gonna call it the blissful state. When you enter into a blissful state. The definition of something that is called the blissful state is this idea of tranquility. You are no longer tormented. There are no thoughts that torment you. There are no emotions that torment you. You find a zone, a space in which those voices in the head that are constantly yammering have gone quiet. And now you can hear yourself think and you can feel yourself feel. This is what al-nafs al-mutma'inna is. That's what it is. It's amazing on how Allah describes it when we get there. Now you have qualified to return to your Lord to be fully satisfied. Because now we can have a relationship. So that's a lot to digest for introspection. So let's now flip and talk a little bit about the retrospection, because it's the other pillar that we'll use for self-improvement. I think to look back at anything we do as human beings objectively is very, very challenging, because we instantly fight an enemy which is insidious, morphs all the time, and is extremely, extremely hard to get around. And that's called bias. Because, boy, who wants to sort of stand in front of a mirror and says, I think I goofed on this one big time? It's always the other way around. So let me tell you why everybody is wrong, what they did to me, why it's not my fault, why it has never been me. It's always that. So this bias is debilitating. So to find a way to really break through it, so we are able to have a moment so we can reflect, is very tough. So it takes time to cultivate. So I acknowledge that, and it happens to all of us without exception. Nobody has the keys to the kingdom on this one. We are all work in progress. So we all work on this to try to get there, but it just takes time in order to get there. I think that generally in retrospection, what really needs to be important if we are able to pass the biases that we have is to really decide on what is a metric for success. Okay, this whole 2022 has gone by. Some have lost a loved one to disease. Some ended up with a broken relationship. Some discovered that they had a child sick in the family. Some lost their jobs. Some had an accident. Allah knows. I mean, the kind of suffering that people go through is just overwhelming. And the question is, what do we do with this? What do we do with all of these in our lives? Do these experiences shape us so they become opportunities to make our better selves? Or do they become boat anchors that we carry around us wherever we go, so we can never reach whatever destination we set in front of ourselves? So what I am pleading for in terms of retrospection, when we look back into the rear view mirror and we look to what we have, is to put these things in context. I watched a movie recently. I believe it's documentary. It's based on real facts of this lady in New Hampshire, who I think it's called Storm or something. This lady in New Hampshire, and she is a search and rescue. And one day she goes up into a mountain for her usual routine, and she finds a human being sitting by himself who wants to take his life. She makes it a point. I mean, he's telling her, leave me alone. She makes it a point to save his life. She saves his life, she brings him back, and all of that. And then at the end, there is this unraveling of the story that is like a teaching moment of infinite wisdom. She confides into him that why she has this instinct of going back to rescue people is because as a mother, she lost 2 daughters in a gas leak who died through carbon monoxide. And she couldn't recover from the loss of the 2 daughters. And the man she rescued was going to end his life because he lost someone he loved. And it's what she said that was mind-blowing. She said, through all of this, I can see the beauty. To all of this, I can see the beauty. There is no human being on this planet, no human being on this planet, who has had in his lifetime all of his children buried by his hands. The Prophet ﷺ did. His boys and his girls, one after the other, he buried them before he left this life, except Fatima, who followed him immediately after his death. And yet, he could see beauty everywhere. You see, retrospection, that's what it is about, is to find out how you take that cognitive bias so we can break through the thick fog and see where the beauty is. And your life will manifest itself in ways that you can never have dreamed of before. So I'm going to leave the last words to Sayyidina Ali رضي الله تعالى عنه. أخرج البخاري عن علي بن أبي طالب أنه قال: ارتحلت الدنيا مدبرة. At some point, two races have begun. Life took off and sailed. وارتحلت الآخرة مقبلة. Together at the same time, as life sailed one way, the calling of the hereafter started sailing our way. It's coming our way. ولكل منهما بنون. For each one of those buses, children are going to board them. So he has a piece of advice. فكونوا من أبناء الآخرة. See if you can consider boarding the bus of the hereafter coming and not the bus of this life disappearing. And this is the absolute genius of how he justifies his advice about why we should do that choice. فإن اليوم عمل وحساب. Today, if you stay in the first bus, there is still a correlation between you take an action and you get accountable for it. But if you board the other bus of the akhirah coming towards you, وغدا حساب ولا عمل. You can't make it up after that because the books are closed. And that, I think, is what the benefit of introspection and retrospection will do. أقول قولي هذا وأستغفر الله لي ولكم فاستغفروه فيغفر المستغفر. الحمد لله ثم الحمد لله واشهد ان لا اله الا الله وحده لا شريك له واشهد ان محمدا عبده ورسوله صلى الله عليه وعلى اله وصحبه وسلم تسليما كثيرا. ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار. اللهم لا تدع لنا ذنبا إلا غفرته ولا هما إلا فرجته ولا دينا إلا قضيته ولا مريضا إلا شفيته ولا مبتلا إلا عافيته ولا ضالا إلا هديته ولا غائبا إلا رددته ولا مظلوما إلا نصرته ولا أسيرا إلا فككته ولا ميتا إلا رحمته ولا ميتا إلا رحمته ولا ميتا إلا رحمته. عباد الله، أوصيكم ونفسي بتقوى الله وأقم الصلاة إن الصلاة تنهى عن الفحشاء والمنكر. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما كثيرا.
الله أكبر الله أكبر. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله. أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله. حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح. قد قامت الصلاة قد قامت الصلاة. الله أكبر الله أكبر. لا إله إلا الله.
Brothers who are at the back, if you would be so kind and move to your right, please. The back rows, please move to your right, please. The back rows, move to your right, please. Thank you. Jazakallah khair. Allahu Akbar.